The Hell Creek Formation is the most iconic dinosaur environment, bar none. The three-horned Triceratops, the dome-headed Pachycephalosaurus, the armored tank Ankylosaurus, and the king of the dinosaurs itself, Tyrannosaurus rex. Yet with all of these noteworthy animals making their way through the late Cretaceous of Laramidia, there is one that is conspicuously inconspicuous: Edmontosaurus. Not having the speed of smaller dinosaurs or any obvious means of defending itself, Edmontosaurus is the quintessential mobile buffet for a hungry tyrannosaur on the prowl. This school of thought is reflected throughout its existence within the public consciousness, the only highlighted feature being its abundance and ability to process plants.
Hadrosaurs are one of the most successful dinosaurs that ever lived.
Huge batteries of chewing teeth make short work of the vegetation.
Anatotitans have the most sophisticated food processor yet devised by nature.
Even the former isn't always the case, as in the Jurassic World movies where it went extinct, presumably due to not being a competitive animal somehow? But this cliché surrounding the crestless Hadrosaurs is false, and in this video I will convince you that Edmontosaurus could not only survive a Tyrannosaur, but come out victorious. And in the end, bring the scene to life with art. I have made previous parts for this video, you can watch them in the playlist, but they aren't required viewing. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the show as I prove to you that a Edmontosaurus can beat a T-Rex. Let's jump into it. First, we must reconstruct the Tyrant Lizard King. Tyrannosaurus is the most famous dinosaur around the world, and this is reflected in its scientific presence. The Rex is by far the most well-studied dinosaur, with almost every part of its feasible biology being the subject of one paper or another over the years. Fortunately for us, this leaves a bounty of information to be gleaned in order to produce an accurate take on this animal. Now we have a decision to make. Which T-Rex? This may seem like an arbitrary question, but it's an important one. Tyrannosaurus has an insane level of individual variation present between the different specimens we have. No two skeletons look exactly alike, and a cursory glance at the skulls alone give a clear view of their differences, almost like different faces. Despite how different these skeletons look though, individual variation has been tested for and been a huge component of Tyrannosaur research for a long time. In the 2008 book Tyrannosaurus Rex the King, Ken Carpenter postulates that Tyrannosaurus Rex had two phenotypic morphs, a gracile morph and a robust morph. This, at the time, was backed by peers, and its well-known explanation was sexual dimorphism, in which the more robust form was considered female due to a wider hip area, which would be helpful for reproduction. We see this most clearly in 1999's Walking with Dinosaurs, where the female Rex we follow throughout the story is much larger and more aggressive than her mate. The intense variety in Tyrannosaurus also made it the target of some classification discourse. The related Tarbosaurus bataar, found in Asia, has historically been considered a species of Tyrannosaurus from time to time, although this hasn't stood up to scrutiny. A 2022 study by Greg Paul and colleagues took the paleontological sphere by storm when it proposed that Tyrannosaurus Rex's variation was grounds enough to split the species in three, thus bringing T. regina and T. imperator into the fold, which are really cool names by the way. This was hugely controversial, with most being decidedly against this idea. A paper responding to Paul later that year by Thomas Carr and co-authors rejected the idea of 3 species of Tyrannosaurus. They found that problems such as ambiguity in specimens that weren't able to be placed into the proposed species, based on skull morphology, insubstantial separation and stratigraphy, and other methodological issues hindered the final conclusion. Now there's another proposed species of Tyrannosaurus, that being T. metriensis, which appears to be valid despite its fragmentary nature. On top of that, they found that the robust and gracile morphs were unsubstantiated. This was found by looking at femoral and tooth ratios and comparing variability with that of over 100 living birds and 4 non-avian theropods, and in doing so found T-Rex to be, quote, unexceptional, and it does not indicate cryptic diversity. So despite superficial differences, the nitty-gritty really doesn't hold up. So individual variation is a huge part of Rex research despite falling within normal dinosaur population dynamics. With that being said, picking an individual specimen allows for a greater level of precision and involvedness, and as an artist, these T-Rexes look very different. It's because what these scientists were measuring were ratios, not so much the shapes of different bones in correlation to each other.
I reconstructed the dinosaur. It wasn't just any Stegosaurus, it was the actual individual that is exhibited in the museum.
For this project, I selected BHI 3033, also known as Stan, named after the man who discovered it in 1989. Stan is one of the most iconic specimens of Tyrannosaurus, along with Sue and the AMNH specimen. It is the most casted Rex, with many museums around the globe housing a clone of Stan. Stan also boasts the most well-complete and well-understood skull of any Rex. In terms of dimensions, Stan is quite average for a Tyrannosaurus, being estimated at 11.78 meters long, and having mass estimates from several studies varying from as low as 5.9 tons to as high as 10.8. The most recent being Sellers et al. 2017, which gives an estimate of approximately 7.2 tons. A very respectable size for an apex predator, but not as large as the true behemoths like Sue or Scotty, and below mass estimates for both Giganotosaurus specimens. Stan is equipped with a number of pathologies that fester throughout the skeleton. None of these were a walk in the park, with several broken ribs that feature Rex tooth scars, a broken neck that miraculously didn't sever the spinal cord in the area, wounds to the jugal, and a punctured brain case. And yet somehow none of these injuries were the animal's cause of death, as they had healed over time. But it just goes to show how brutal the life of a T-Rex really was. Stan's skull has been featured in many biomechanical studies that each bring insight into how a Tyrannosaurus may have used its crushing jaws. While it is an obvious fact that no terrestrial animal comes close to the sheer power in a T-Rex's bite force, discussion has been brought up surrounding how its skull reacted to such forces. Cost et al. In 2019 used Stan's skull in a finite element analysis to see if a Tyrannosaurus could possibly exhibit craniokinesis. This is when the different bones within the skull can move while the jaws deliver their payload. Other dinosaurs have been found to be able to do this, with a notable example being the enigmatic Argentine saurischian Herrerasaurus. Using their methods, which involved comparisons with 2 modern reptiles, the African grey parrot and the tokay gecko, they found that despite the prominent suturing found in the skull of the dinosaur, Stan had to have had a completely akinetic skull so that a bite wouldn't crush the skull. That's how powerful their jaws were. Of course, this has led to another famous aspect of T-Rex, that being its ability to crush bone. Gignac and Erickson looked at this behavior in more detail in 2017, and the idea is more than just a cliche that makes sense on paper. Tyrannosaurid coprolites contain many bone fragments, which indicates that they did eat skeletal elements in life. These fragments were also significantly rounded compared to their crushed nature, which implies that the stomachs of these theropods were highly acidic. Surprisingly enough, this behavior is somewhat unique within reptiles. Most reptiles alive today, including most lizards, including all snakes, tuataras, and birds, are unable to cause any meaningful damage to bones. The only exceptions I can think of are lammergeiers and some other birds of prey that drop bones from high elevations to access the marrow within, but that isn't them doing the processing on their own. Larger reptilian predators either swallow bones in their entirety with shallow scores left on them, such as the case with Komodo dragons, or they puncture and crack bones without finer processing with direct purpose, as seen in crocodilians. Osteophagy is much more prevalent in mammals, especially canids and other similar carnivores. Tyrannosaurus is one of the few reptiles that went out of its way to crush bone despite its apparent lack of chewing on the level of modern mammals. With the amount of sheer force that the jaws could unleash, they had powerful muscles that were able to make it happen. Clear muscle attachment points are seen throughout the back of the skull and fill in the infra and supratemporal fenestrae. The supratemporal fenestra, while being home to a large muscle group attached to the lower jaw, was also where in living crocodilians a network of blood vessels were that acted as a temperature regulatory system. This has been thought to be present in dinosaurs as well, and while this isn't that related to the video, I thought it was really cool, and Brian Eng made a whole video on it that you should totally check out. T-Rex had some of the best senses of any animal ever, and proportionately giant eyeballs facing forward for depth perception, which, by the way, most theropods had, just not to this extent. Despite this, it is possible that a large part of the eye could be completely obscured. This is how Mark Whitten chose to reconstruct Sue in Colony Tall 2023. Sclerotic rings are circles of bone within the orbit that support the eyeball. I am unaware of any sclerotic rings discovered in this species in particular, but they greatly inhibit how big an animal's eye can be, as the eyeball has to poke between the hole in the ring. And of course, the smell of Tyrannosaurus would have easily allowed it to track prey down from kilometers away, and it's so famous of a scent that even Jack Horner had to talk about how good it was.
I doubt very much if we could hunt very well in the evening or in the morning, but we look right here, the olfactory lobe is huge. So from this we can see that T-Rex couldn't see well, but it had a tremendous sense of smell.
A quick note on the tongue. Many depictions have shown theropods with either supramuscular tongues like the ridiculous appendage in Walking with Dinosaurs, or croc-like immobile tongues seen in things like PNSO figures. While there is a correlation between more complex feeding strategies and tongue complexity, the crocodilian tongue isn't too reasonable to me, since that's an adaptation to prevent water entering the throat. Brian Eng has even speculated that theropods may have had similar adaptations to predatory birds, which can have spiked tongues, but there isn't much to support that. It's a cool idea, though. I'm going to go with the type of tongue that was used in a Saurian Rex, which is a generically Lepidosaur-esque tongue. Ironically, I don't think I drew a tongue for any of these drawings. Oh well. One of Stan's most prominent features are its gargantuan teeth. These things really bring the factoid of T-Rex teeth being the size of bananas to the forefront. In actuality, this is caused by tooth slippage. After the animal died, the gums and other gingival tissue rot, and the teeth are no longer locked in place. This is something to always watch out for when referencing skeletal mounts, since they don't always account for this. To support such a massive head, powerful neck muscles were in play that moved and aimed at Rex's business end at unwary adversaries. In a prior video where I mentioned T-Rex neck musculature, I said this.
There were some nice figures, and I learned a bit about how the muscles inserted and where, but there were some holes. The neck muscle paper I found neglected all of the throat area, which I guess makes sense since it was focused more on the biomechanical implications, but I digress.
Well, past me was kind of an idiot. The reason there aren't significant muscles that left noticeable scars on the bones down there is because A, there were no bones down there, and B, that's where the esophagus and trachea were. You idiots! The muscle groups reconstructed show insights into how a theropod such as T-Rex would have fed. They seemed almost like a mosaic of modern archosaur biology. In the end, this study finds a number of possible actions, including dorsiflexion during inertial feeding and drinking, which was demonstrated well in Prehistoric Planet, high-geared lateral flexion similar to that of crocodilians, and for the purposes of this video, a hell of a robust neck. Snively and Russell in 2007 go into extreme detail on each and every neck muscle in both birds and crocodilians, as well as the Tyrant, so if you're into that sort of thing, go read it, it's open access. Tyrannosaurus' general frame has gone through an overhaul over the years. The most drastic since the dinosaur renaissance was the increased bulk that T-Rex has apparently gotten. We see in a lot of post-Renaissance paleo art that Tyrannosaurus is suffering from shrink wrapping to some extent. Interestingly enough, this was less of a problem in Rex compared to, say, Velociraptor, most likely because a muscular Rex is more intimidating than a skinny, shriveled one. This is why the rounder Rex has received some public backlash, but of course, those people shouldn't be taken seriously. Even compared to other megatheropods, T-Rex is quite burly with a much wider frame. This was amplified when properly adding the gastralia to the skeleton. These belly ribs give the ventral side a much smoother profile, lacking the pronounced ischio boot we see in a lot of reconstructions. Don't be mistaken though, This is muscle. Gastralia are literally ossified abs. Of course, fat deposits are definitely possible, but I figure that they would be less prominent on theropods simply because of how predators look super muscular from exerting so much effort in prey capture. It's also worth pointing out that T-Rex was definitely capable of predation, just in case there's anyone who watched Valley of the T-Rex.
They're second, and they have to crush bone. And T-Rex, being a bone crusher, probably is getting there second.
A bit of fun storytelling added to my reconstruction is a pair of 3 claw marks. The idea is that they were caused when the animal was younger by a failed hunting attempt from a Dakota raptor. Now, I know Dakota raptor is a controversial genus with parts being turtle bones and other parts being potentially Anzu bones. A real mess, but that doesn't discount that an animal like it exists or may have existed even if Dakota raptor itself was invalid, although if that were the case, then this would be speculation. Easily the most ridiculed part of a T-Rex are those dinky forearms. Of course, with the advent of other similar megatheropods and Apatosaurus existing, it's gotten quite old. But they were powerfully muscular and robust arms, easily being more powerful than the strongest of people, despite being comparable in size. The first finger was slightly shorter than the second, with a longer claw. There have been a ton of hypotheses surrounding the use of these appendages, and personally, I think most are valid, except that they were vestigial, because why would they be so powerful then? Things like grappling prey, getting off the ground, holding on while mating, or limited help dismembering prey are all valid to a certain degree. Tyrannosaurus hind limbs, on the other hand, or should I say other foot, I'm so funny guys, are a different story entirely. They were insanely powerful limbs that propelled the dinosaur in whichever direction it wanted. T-Rex and other non-avian theropods, in general, had very similar structures to their hind limbs as those of terrestrially adapted birds. And in fact, ratites are some of the best references when drawing theropod limbs. Tyrannosaurus has undergone many different studies surrounding its gait and speed. It is thought to have had a neutral stance that was upright, but not quite columnar. Hutchinson et al. 2011 state that Tyrannosaurus had proportionately larger hip and thigh muscles than those of modern ratites, which already have obscenely muscular legs. However, this makes sense, since modern birds are more reliant on kicking their shin while running rather than using their thighs. And in fact, if you look at an ostrich, most of that muscle is calf muscle. Meanwhile, in a locomotory sense, Rex was kind of all over the place. Studies have used various techniques to determine how fast a tyrannosaur could move, and results have been inconsistent to say the least. Sellers et al. Suggest that T-Rex wouldn't be capable of running at all. This checks out though, since true running would involve both legs being off the ground at once, and even the speedster Rex from Jurassic Park never actually does this. Sellers et al. 2017 found that a max speed of 7.7 meters per second was possible on the higher end of stresses placed on the legs of over 200 megapascals. But that further speeds with the sizes they were at would have crushed the legs, and then they applied this reasoning to other long-legged and large megatheropods such as the Carcharodontosaurids. Snively et al. Found that a derived feature of Tyrannosaur feet, the arctometatarsallian foot, was a contributing factor to effective prey capture and rapid linear locomotion, with its foot being able to resist torsion when maneuvering. And the study also found that Tyrannosaurs in general were a very mobile clade and were able to outperform Carcharodontosaurids when it comes to agility. They, quote, regressed agility estimates against body mass incorporating super-ellipse-based modeled mass, centers of mass, and rotational inertia. And I don't really understand much of that. It's a lot of physics. They state that they kept results consistent with previous studies, which should include Sellers et al. 2017, but that paper is not cited as a source. Another study in 2017 looked at the speed of several extant and extinct animals, and found a parabolic correlation between size and speed, considering that large animals got faster than smaller ones to a certain extent before gradually becoming slower again. And they plotted some dinosaurs into this as well, and gave T-Rex a speed of around 28 kilometers per power. It would be supported by snively tall to some degree because of T-Rex's agility, although T-Rex was probably fast for a large theropod, but in absolute terms, it's really up in the air. It would probably still be able to catch you, though. A 2021 study by Bigler et al. Found the preferred walking gait of a T-Rex using biomechanical models that estimated tail frequency, simulations involving ligament and muscle attachment sites surrounding the tail, and just a whole bunch of physics that I'm not going to pretend to understand, to predict how a Rex would walk comfortably. The result was slower than a person's average walk at around 1.28 meters per second. This, of course, while slow, was an energy-efficient means of locomotion and isn't a top speed by any means. Much of the locomotory abilities of a theropod are derived from its tail muscles. The M. caudofemoralis longus is the most talked about in this instance, and for good reason. This huge tail muscle attached to the fourth trochanter on the femur, and was what pulled the leg back. Some theropods, most notably Carnotaurus, had absolute units of tail muscles that imply a heavily powerful running capability. And in this regard, Rexy was no slouch. Persons and Curry in 2011 found that the proportional size of the tail didn't vary remarkably when the animal grew, as seen when they analyzed the related Gorgosaurus. And this very much implied cursorial ability in Stan, who was used in this study also. When compared to various other reptiles, Stan had the largest caudofemoralis longus by far, with it taking up 58% of tail bulk. Ornithomimus, followed by Gorgosaurus, were the runners-up, and the black and white tegu came in last place. With how muscular the tail is, Brian Eng has stated that you could get away with drawing a straight line from the pubis to the tail tip and just fill it in with muscle. While he was talking about Allosaurus, certainly applies to Tyrannosaurus, and you can see this to some extent in the reconstruction of Stan that was in this paper that Scott Hartman made. So at this point I've gotten pretty decently far on this artwork, but something isn't quite doing it for me. For inspiration, I'm gonna look in this book I got from the Royal Ontario Museum, like, gosh, must have been 12 years ago, 11 years ago? And it has all this great paleo artwork by Julius Chotany. Like, see, very nice landscape, mural type thing. Look, it's Alfred Wagner. This is probably one of my favorites. Got Saurosuchus, Pisanosaurus, Eoraptor, Herrerasaurus. You can see the scale detail on the head because that's the closest, and it gets less detailed, but it's still really detailed because these are 3D models, they're not actual drawings. But yeah, I'm just gonna look through here for good references. There's a bufo, no! Integument is what covers the exterior of an animal, and this has been a fluid subject for T-Rex. Historic depictions gave it reptilian skin covered in scales, and occasionally with an elephantine addition of wrinkles, especially in toys. During the early 2010s and the discovery of increasingly feathered dinosaurs of many clades, sizes, and niches, a fully feathered Rex became somewhat of a norm. I, for one, was totally cool with the fluffy Rex, as I didn't then, and still don't care about which depictions are cool, but which depictions are scientifically sound. It's something I'm proud of my younger self. Nowadays, an almost, if not completely scaly Rex is the accepted notion that we follow. To understand this, we should look at the body of evidence we have. The most direct source of data we have is skin impressions, and for that, we thankfully have a few from T-Rex. There are patches of scaly skin located at the ilium, back of the neck, and tail preserved on the specimen HMNS 2006.1743.01. These scales were a millimeter or less in diameter and were smooth and unornamented. To understand whether the Rex had feathers, we turn to phylogenetic bracketing and biomechanics. When looking at its relatives, T-Rex had a strong amount of evidence for being fluffy. We see Coelurosaurs in general being ancestrally feathered, and each group contains examples of feather preservation. In Tyrannosauroidea, we have Dilong and Eutyrannus with large swaths of feather traces, and with Eutyrannus this extends to all ontogenetic stages and covers the animal from head to toe. Eutyrannus was used as a smoking gun for a while since it was also a very large animal, being upwards of 9 or 10 meters in length. There is, however, a trend with Tyrannosaurs that more basal forms tended to have higher feather content, with Tyrannosaurids not having any direct evidence of feathers, and fellow Tyrannosaurs like Gorgosaurus having scale impressions. Bell et al. 2017 took a look at feathers and gigantism in Tyrannosaurs and found that giant proceratosaurids like Eutyrannus and Sinotyrannus evolved large size independently from derived Tyrannosaurids. They also found that feather loss was a byproduct of gigantism in general, and that with the size of T-Rex, it would have retained far too much heat. It's also worth noting that the Yishion Formation, where Eutyrannus lived, was far colder than the Hell Creek Formation, and most animals there were fluffy. Thus, the current consensus is a scaly Rex. There is, however, reasonable speculation that some feathers may have existed, just not in any immense quantities. I decided to give the T-Rex tarsal scutes, which I added in part 2 but cut in part 1. The reasoning I gave in part 1 was that those scutes on birds were homologous with feathers on the foot and were secondarily evolved into scales. People took issue with this because of Concavinator having these scutes. This, however, like Your Dinosaurs Are Wrong says, implies that Concavinator may have also been descended from a feathered ancestor.
And if the ones that we see in Concavenator are homologous with the ones in birds, those develop from feather play coats. So maybe it's secondarily featherless? It's also possible that even if it was mostly featherless as an adult, it might have had more extensive covering as a chick.
So that logic is sound for most theropods in general, and Coelurosaurians in particular, since all of T-Rex's distant ancestors were most likely feathered. Now the facial area is where things get interesting. The most common depiction of large theropod faces right now includes large feature scales on the face, keratin crests, and lips. Carr and colleagues in 2017, while describing a new species at the time, Dueling horneri, argued an integument that functioned like sensory organs that are found in crocodilians. These organs in crocodilians are found all over the muzzle and are used to detect changes in water pressure. They found the foramina on the mandibular region, which is seen in most archosaurs, could have supported these organs. This is supported by the amount of facial scarring we see in Tyrannosaurus from their conspecifics, and facial rubbing may have been an important way these animals communicated or even bonded. The problem lies in the fact that crocodiles don't actually have facial scales in this way, but more of a keratin sheath that became cracked with age in a manner that resembles scales. The foramina themselves are interpreted differently in the now famous 2023 paper by Cullen and co-authors, and the flawed use of crocodilian scales have had some cast doubt on the sensory organ hypothesis. Carr's paper also observes a reduction in facial coarseness from subadults to old individuals, especially on the nasals. Facial rugosities are generally associated with keratinized features of some form, and this could mean less pronounced ornamentation as the animal got old, but I don't really know for sure, so please let me know in the comments. In 2023, Cullen et al. Published a paper with the intent on understanding theropod extraoral tissue, and they used T-Rex as the case study. They looked at several factors such as comparisons of tooth proportions across modern lipped saurians, and enamel deterioration and tooth replacement rates. They looked at the Splendosaurus tooth and other data sets, and came to the conclusion that theropods most likely had lips. Even Tyrannosaurs. They found that in terms of tooth size, T-Rex didn't even have the largest proportional teeth. That esteem belonged to the very lipped crocodile monitor. The enamel on the observed tooth hadn't decayed at the rate of a tooth constantly dry and exposed to the elements. Most terrestrial tetrapods have lips, and those that don't are either toothless, are tusks, or have a source of hydration for their teeth, like crocodilians. Also, having lips keeps a tight oral seal, which is good for not dehydrating. So from the looks of it, T-Rex had lips. There's also the possibility that T-Rex or other theropods had enough gums and other tissue in their mouths that the teeth were hardly visible. So many lizards have huge teeth, but you can never really tell. I did this in the first attempt I did at the drawing, and some people weren't the most thrilled with it. Personally, I think it's completely possible, but it's pure speculation, so I went with the more exposed look for this. It's worth noting that I kept the large scales proposed in Carr et al. This looks really cool. And even if the exact function of sensory scales weren't analogous to crocodilians, T-Rex almost certainly had a very sensitive face. The color scheme I came up with in part 1, but I never really based it on anything. Just kinda thought it looked cool and used some fairly grounded colors. While drawing, however, I referenced a broad-headed skink, a savanna monitor, and a green iguana for the stripes. The crests I made bluish as a form of structural color. This is color produced by the shape of an animal's integument, not any actual pigment. Structural color is often iridescent to some degree and can't be seen in unfavorable lighting conditions. So I figured if a T-Rex is hunting and sticking to the shadows, the blue would look gray and not be a huge detriment. I also made the eyes green, since I thought they looked cool and were a contrast to the red around it. And of course, gotta have that counter shading.
Wait, are you making a video right now?
Yes, I am.
A video about it?
Montreal.
Now, remember the time in grade 9 when I made you go deaf for an hour?
Hey, remember the time you've said that like a billion kajillion times?
Remember the time that Evan told us to kill ourselves? Why am I still missing? I'm so
I mean, I don't remember exactly which time. Evan is not a fan of mental health. See, Evan's the anti-suicide prevention hotline.
I'm joking!
No, don't you know you need to go to the therapy doctor because you said that.
Yeah, we could.
Who, me?
No, me. Look what's wrong.
Why did you activate unlockable on yourself?
Me?
Because that's when oh shit, I did everything.
That's I don't know.
To.
Stop, I don't want to activate a power-up. I clicked something by accident. Ah. Hey, can you like shut up, man? The physics.
What did you guys end up getting in your classes?
Didn't we already discuss this?
Probably.
Oh my god, wait, why is this one so bad?
I can't. No, I was so bad at this.
Not gonna lie, I just lied. Not gonna lie.
Wow, I'm doing so bad.
So bad. That was really good.
Oh, what's the Sigma?
Yeah, bitch!
Guys, did I get the least amount of points?
How?
I don't know.
Man.
Now, you're so good at this game.
Now enter the Rex's opponent, Edmontosaurus annectans. In a similar manner to Tyrannosaurus, Edmontosaurus is the most well-studied hadrosaur out there. Edmontosaurus has been known for a long time, and in fact has experienced pretty much every hadrosaur trope out there. And I'm not just talking about the whole predator thing. We see historical depictions of it as a semi-aquatic animal living in swamps. It's just not the case. They were very terrestrial animals, and we'll get to that when we talk about the hands and feet. Edmontosaurus was actually named by Lawrence Lamb after specimens from the Horseshoe Canyon Formation in Alberta. Generally, Edmontosaurus is found to be the same size or even smaller than a Rex, but this isn't always the case. Now I figured the best chance an animal with no obvious means of defending itself has is sheer size. And for that reason, I based this reconstruction on MOR 1142, aka X-Rex. Again, I couldn't find any actual pictures or descriptions of these specimens.
You fool!
Contrary to my stupid past self, I was actually able to see a few pictures and measurements of X-Rex. This specimen was an isolated tail, which by itself measured 7.5 meters in length. That alone makes this Edmontosaurus longer than the longest T-Rex if it had average proportions. Estimates for the full size of X-Rex suggest a length upwards of 50 feet and 10 tons. To me that seems a little light and all, but I'm not an expert by any means. Edmontosaurus seem to have the same dramatic extent of individual variation that Tyrannosaurus did.
We're sorry. The number you reached has been disconnected.
Oh, you're a doofus.
Edmontosaurus had crazy individual variation when it came to size and head shape. I was kind of stupid saying otherwise in the last video. Eonectans has gone by many names before, the most well known of which is most likely Anatotitan and Anatosaurus, both of which housed many other species. There's also the third species of Edmontosaurus, E. saskatchewanensis, but that is also now considered to be Eonectans. Specimens considered Anatotitan had, among other things, a lower and longer head, which I really like the look of. I applied this to X-Rex because there is a trend of older and larger Edmontosaurus specimens having longer heads. Edmontosaurus had an interesting ecological quirk within the Hill Creek Formation. Many times it's portrayed as the most abundant animal in the area, with large herds moving along and it being the primary food source of T-Rex. This isn't representative of how this worked within the ecosystem, however. Horner et al. In 2011 did a census of the different collected taxa from various locales within the formation, and they found some interesting stuff. Triceratops was easily the most common animal in Hill Creek, with it being the most numerous in every locality. Edmontosaurus, however, was either around the same level of abundance as T-Rex or was as low as half as common. Normally, predators are significantly outnumbered by their prey species. It's just a necessity for a sustainable ecosystem since one carnivore feeds on a lot of prey throughout its life. The interesting thing is the paper suggests that this may have been close to the actual ecological ratio at the time, since preservation bias isn't an obvious factor with the conditions and size of both animals being similar. This may suggest that Edmontosaurus didn't frequent areas where preservation was as likely, or maybe something else is at play, but it's an adequate mystery to get your head scratching. The study also found that Edmontosaurus was commonly found in silt and sandstone alongside Ornithomimus and Ankylosaurus. I haven't seen very much paleo art with those three interacting, so I'd love to see more of it. And of course, for some reason, Thescelosaurus was only found in Mudstone, which isn't really related, but hey, Thescelosaurus mentioned.
And that's very good.
X-Rex being a tail is somewhat relevant, since that is one of the most common places Edmontosaurus would get pathologies of some kind. Siviero et al. In 2020 looked at an Edmontosaurus bone bed in the Lance Formation, which is basically a hop and a skip from Hell Creek, and found some patterns and pathologies that might give insight into how an Edmontosaurus may have defended itself, as well as other behavioral clues. They found that the most common injuries on the Hadrosaurs were fractures and hypertrophic ossification of the vertebral spines of the caudals. 96 of the specimens had these types of injuries, which suggest some sort of stress associated with pretty habitual Edmontosaurus activities. Some pathologies have been interpreted as attempts of predation from T-Rex, others as tramplings from other herd members. The authors of this paper don't think that trampling was a huge cause just because of less trauma than expected on the chevrons. They also write that there's evidence of strain and injuries caused by rotating the tail laterally. This is possible evidence of Edmontosaurus using its tail as defense in some aspect. I know it's been theorized a bit, but it's nice to see it in a publication, and this is one of the few times Jurassic Fight Club actually got something right.
Making it a potent weapon that could be swung like the arm of a crane.
There were also injuries on the hands that could be interpreted as being used in defense, but there isn't a straightforward answer to that one, since the hands of Edmontosaurus could have been used for a multitude of. A later paper in 2022 by Ann et al. Also looked at caudal vertebra pathologies in Edmontosaurus, and there's more to the tail than at first glance. Get it? Tail, and also tail. Edmontosaurus had extremely bulky tails with a network of ossified tendons and heavy muscle that held it straight and upright. Further down the tail, it was able to be moved with significant flexibility, and that old or scarred individuals with damaged ossified tendons had even greater flexibility, though I'm sure that would have hurt a lot. This paper used X-ray microtomography and took away that the unremarkable microstructure of the tail compared to what one would expect of a highly injured one was evidence of it forming due to, quote, long-term biomechanical stresses exerted on this section of the tail by both lateral and dorsoventral motions of the tail. This seems to corroborate what the 2020 paper suggested, and it's more evidence of Edmontosaurus habitually using its tail with some sort of stressful function, such as predator deterrence. Edmontosaurus was a facultative quadruped that could move bipedally when needed. Maidment et al. 2014 examined muscle moment arms in Edmontosaurus and other archosaurs. They found that taxa with increased quadrupedalism left evidence in their level of flexion moment arms when compared to bipedal animals. Edmontosaurus had high moment arms, which contrasted other ornithischians like the examined Chasmosaurus and Hypsilophodon. This implied a more columnar stance when they reared up on two legs. The legs were stocky and robust, capable of great power to move such a large animal. The feet are the quintessential ornithopod foot, with a striking resemblance to bird feet with 3 toes, hence the name. I know that in my last video I gave Edmontosaurus a dew claw. They in fact did not have a dew claw, and I don't know where I got that from. Prehistoric Planet stated during the Rex hunt in swamps that Edmontosaurus was able to run faster than a Tyrannosaurus in a straight chase.
They lack armor, but they're as big as T-Rex and twice as fast.
I couldn't find any papers on Edmontosaurus' speed, unlike the several that T-Rex has. Closest I found was a 1982 study by Richard Thulborn that put large ornithopods and carnosaurs as comparable somewhat, but only capable of trotting or walking, which honestly isn't that far off when we think. It's also interesting to note that while most people interpret Edmontosaurus to run bipedally when it had the chance, Prehistoric Planet had it run quadrupedally, which I just find interesting. In general, Edmontosaurus was a bulky animal with a somewhat wide frame, although not as extreme as T-Rex, proportionally speaking. Modern large herbivores tend to have large guts for digesting plants. Edmontosaurus, like some other hadrosaurs, had a row of feature scales along its back that sat atop some fairly substantial neural spines, giving it a very tall look. Honestly, now that I'm thinking about it, perhaps the tall nature of Edmontosaurus' frame could have acted as some sort of intimidation against predators, and also just made it harder to grasp onto. Edmontosaurus had decently muscular forelimbs that were well equipped to support a quadrupedal lifestyle. The historic reconstructions of hadrosaur limbs were very graceful and slender, but a steady strengthening of the forelimbs has occurred since then. The hands are well known based on the exquisitely preserved mummy Dakota. The most famous part of its preserved soft tissue was a manus that showed how very terrestrial Edmontosaurus was. A large mitten-like hoof covered the middle 3 fingers, with the first projecting down and the 5th acting almost like a little spur. The hand had large flat scales that ran up the lower arm from the hand, with smaller scales accompanying it. While this is some truly remarkable stuff, I didn't draw any Edmontosaurus hands during the final artwork, so I never made up for the quite bad-looking ones I previously drew.
Oh, poop.
Edmontosaurus and other Hadrosaurs had quite a few neck depictions ranging from robust to slender to robust again. Bertozzo et al. 2020 gave a revised look at Parasaurolophus based on the type specimen of P. walkeri, which I saw with some friends at the ROM like a month ago. Besides observations of the truly sorry state that the poor guy was in with all of its ridiculous injuries, the author looked at the nuchal ligament which held up the head and neck, and proposed a few different possibilities for how robust and what shape the neck would take. For my artwork, and the robust neck would give a bit of a challenge for a Rex to snack on. I chose to give this Edmontosaurus a sort of dewlap, which I thought looked pretty cool, and I based it on an iguana / an anoles dewlap that the males use for display. Iguanas also make head movements using their dewlap in an intimidation display, and a similar behavior with this reconstruction would be a cool artwork, I think. Like I mentioned earlier, large Edmontosaurus, designated as a Natatitan, had long, low skulls. This is among the things that distinguished Anectons and Regalis. Regalis had a soft tissue comb that really broke the mold of Saurolophine hadrosaurs, and some people have added it to Anectons as well. This is honestly possible since soft tissue can either be very consistent between species or wildly different. I didn't add one just because there isn't evidence for it. A mummy of Edmontosaurus had very clear striations along the mineralized beak, and it had a sort of down-turned, almost hook-like appearance, which was portrayed beautifully in Prehistoric Planet. Hadrosaurs didn't really have duckbills. Although I think that name is super fitting just because of how goofy it sounds, and it's just endearing, I don't know. Like with T-Rex, a sclerotic ring can be added to reduce how big the eye is on the exterior. To portray the Edmontosaurus as old and battle-scarred, I made it blind in one eye. This makes it look a bit scarier, like what they did with the Tyrannosaurus in Jurassic World Dominion, which despite the design being wonky, was one of the few good things in that movie. Besides appearances, animals that have impaired or poor vision tend to be more aggressive in their means of predator deterrence, since more things can be perceived as a threat. This is most famous in rhinos and giant anteaters, and makes the scenario of a duckbill turning the tables on a predator more believable. Now, an equivalent debate to lips on dinosaurs is cheeks on dinosaurs. The traditional style of reconstructing ornithischians is with large and somewhat muscular cheeks to hold in food. This, however, was questioned by Nawabizadeh in 2018. Muscular cheeks often seen in depictions of like those of Walking with Dinosaurs aren't exactly reasonable. Modern animals who possess cheeks are mammals, and mammal-like cheeks were evolved for suckling. Nawabizadeh reconstructed the jaw abductor muscles in a much more similar fashion to what we'd expect from theropod dinosaurs and modern reptiles. There are, however, points on the cheek side. The inset nature of ornithischian teeth leave a shelf where cheeks would fit nicely, and osteological correlates don't disprove the existence of cheeks per se, but the most likely form would probably be a sort of skin flap to hold food in, while there's also the possibility of there being lizard-like lips, similar to what's thought for theropods. Herbivorous lizards, after all, manage just fine with them. I feel that a skin membrane is probably the case for a derived hadrosaur like Edmontosaurus, since the group is best known for its complex food processing and chewing as opposed to the simple stripping and cropping of vegetation seen in things like sauropods, thyreophorans, and so on. And of course, there are several papers that focus on Edmontosaurus' ability as a chewer. Williams et al. In 2009 used 3D modeling and other methods to figure out how Edmontosaurus used its battery of teeth. They came to the conclusion that they were grazers more so than browsers, which is interesting considering they were the tallest dinosaurs in Hell Creek unless a random Alamosaurus showed up. I wonder what would have filled the high browsing role if that were the case. In this instance though, Edmontosaurus would have had powerful jaws, and biting would be a certainly effective defense mechanism from a T-Rex, and while not fatal, it would cause extreme pain. I mean, look at all those tiny teeth. That would totally crush your hand. When deciding the color scheme for this hadrosaur, I used several different schemes of various colors, but I ended up with this one, which I based on an indigo snake and an eastern coach whip. Now, I just thought it looked neat, but despite its out there appearance, I can justify it somewhat. Indigo snakes look black under a lot of lighting, but in the right conditions shine a brilliant blue. Otherwise, indigo snakes would be a stupid name. That and the contrast of the orange just made sense from a color theory perspective. I changed it more to a red hue, however, since I was also inspired by mud snakes. I feel I got the dark and muddy nature better in my original, but even so, I think that an old Edmontosaurus could get away with being bright blue. The biggest thing with predators is to find the easiest prey possible to take down, so the chances of getting a meal are high enough for it to be worth it. A huge bull Edmontosaurus is almost never going to be in that position unless it's extremely old or sick. Dinosaurs were extremely visual animals, and it's likely that most had excellent color vision like modern birds, so visual display would be an important factor. But looking at modern large animals, the majority are quite dull, but they're mammals that can't actually produce colorful pigments or don't rely on color vision. Interestingly enough, this is the third blue design I've made for this species. The other ones I based off on northern shoveler and harlequin duck, and some other things I can't remember. I also gave them speculative air sacs for display like prairie chickens, and in the second one I gave it a crest like Regalis. I must have been subliminally inspired by my previous designs. I just think blue and Edmontosaurus look good together. Like in the last video, I decided to make this individual partially leucistic. I made a whole video on color variations within animals, but to quickly sum it up, leucism is when an animal appears white or yellow because of a lack of pigment. Partial leucism is self-explanatory, and it's sometimes called piebaldism. The reason I used it is because I figured that an animal that was as exposed to predators as it was, due to its bright white coloration, having survived this long means it was one hell of a survivor. I kept it partial though, just to have another color scheme. Also, I'm just going to say that this version of Edmontosaurus only becomes blue when its growth plateaus and it's mature. There, got some ontogeny for you. Now, before I give my full reasoning on why I chose Edmontosaurus as the outcome, I've got to say some stuff about the environment of Hell Creek. This slab of rock is thought to be subtropical in climate, with conditions similar to southern Florida. Many different river channels and swamps occurred here, and these have gotten their own papers just on their bivalve communities. A lot of the flora we found are body fossils and pollen of quite familiar species. Sequoias, ginkgos, and other large trees are abundant, and the Araucarian dominance shown in Walking with Dinosaurs is a bit overstated, although they still flourish. Plenty of other conifers and deciduous plants formed lush canopies and understories with a vast assortment of aquatic plants, including lotus and water cabbage relatives being common. Other more typical Mesozoic plants were rarer. Few ferns have been found, and not in large numbers. Horsetails were quite rare as well. Cycadophytes and other palms were around, but no palmettos were quite there, or at least that's what I know now. I actually thought that this palm, Sabellites, was a form of palmetto just by their superficial resemblance. Without thinking all that much, I ran with it and covered the understory in them since I didn't want to do ferns, or a giant mishmash of different plants.
What is wrong with you people?
So you paleobotanist nitpickers can give your grief in the comments. But regardless, this is a pretty typical depiction of the Hell Creek, and these palmettos were seen in abundance within When Dinosaurs Roamed America's Hell Creek segment, so they're mostly speculation now, I guess. I added ginkgos, tulip tree relatives, and this conifer I have a hard time pronouncing as the main trees, along with Araucaria, of course. Araucaria is a monkey puzzle tree, by the way. I didn't think of too many animals to add. I had forgotten about them, to be honest, but I was given another idea to put in an orb weaver web. So I don't know how I'm gonna do this. Just dip my pencil in alcohol, and I'm just gonna do. Well, that looks kind of terrible, but you can barely see it. So now all of this is fine and dandy. We've looked at the most relevant aspects of our contenders and have a decent idea of what they're capable of. Now, what exactly would the outcome be of these two animals colliding? Well, nature is seldom black and white, and pretty much any combination of scenarios must have played out when regarding the chances of either behemoth coming out on top. If we take a stat-focused approach, which I don't believe is all that useful, we get the following. The Edmontosaurus was bigger in both length and height bipedally, and potentially in weight, although that's up in the air. I think it's worth noting that there aren't many modern terrestrial ecosystems where the largest animal is also an apex predator. It feels unlikely that it would be much different in the past. They were pretty comparable in terms of mobility, but T-Rex may have been more agile and Edmontosaurus may have had greater speed and stamina. And with the data being this inconclusive, it's hard to say. T-Rex would take the edge in intelligence, which I neglected to mention simply because it is one giant can of worms I don't want to touch right now.
You guys are hopeless. I leave you for 5 minutes and I come back to a disaster.
But it's almost certainly the case that T-Rex is one of the most intelligent dinosaurs. Weaponry is closer than one might think, with the T-Rex's crushing bite being unlikely to deliver a clean one-shot on the Edmontosaurus. Edmontosaurus' tail and limbs were formidable as well. With how seemingly evenly matched these two are, we look to modern predator-prey dynamics to provide some much-needed insight into how these interactions play out today. Mark Whitten wrote an excellent blog post surrounding the efficacy and usage of horns in predator defense in ceratopsians, coming to the conclusion that while horns may have been used in predator deterrence, it wasn't the primary use or pressure for them to evolve in the first place. Instead, ritualized combat with other members of their own species and species identification were much more likely reasons for the evolution of horns along with display. From a functionalist perspective, it stands to reason that if there was a certain way that best helped defend from intelligent and adept bipedal bear traps, one would expect a certain level of convergence between different ceratopsian taxa towards a similar horn and frill arrangement just from natural selection. Yet this is very clearly not the case. Ignoring ceratopsians and looking towards the extant analogs that the whole discussion was based on, we see conflicting results around the effectiveness of superficial armaments. The presence of horns rarely presents meaningful protection from attempted predation, and many predators frequently hunt or even specialize in horned and antlered animals. This is compounded by the fact that modern animals that are both unarmed and unable to evade predation aren't under extreme pressure compared to their ecological peers. The many species of tapir are a terrific example of this. Tapirs are the largest terrestrial herbivores found on the South American continent. They are nonetheless smaller than the other continent's heavy hitters, with them being about twice as large as their predators, the jaguar and puma. A 2016 study by Azevedo and co-authors surveyed the diet of a population of pumas in fragmented dry forest habitat. In their 85 samples of scat recovered, only one contained remains of tapir, which was determined to be a juvenile. It isn't clear how the animal was consumed, whether it be scavenging or predation, but the authors lean towards an opportunistic hunting attempt. It was noted that tapirs were an unusual prey item for cougars. Another study in 2017 found the first recorded instance of a tapir being killed by a jaguar, first recorded with a distinct bite to the skull and evidence of dragging the prey afterwards. This was another juvenile tapir, and it was stated that while numerous tapirs have shown injuries from attempted predation, they either survive or die sometime later due to sepsis. Another large herbivorous animal that's often brought up in favor of Edmontosaurus being no pushover is the giant moose. Moose are the largest deer currently alive today, and they are quite known for their fierce ability to defend themselves. And this is for good reason. When living amongst wolves, cougars, black bears, brown bears, and on occasion polar bears, it's important to not be immediately picked off. These different predators often hunt moose throughout different life stages. Bears are a great threat to calves, who they take for minimal struggle. Packs of wolves are more generalist and will attack during all life stages, but it's important to note that for a wolf pack's hunt to succeed, their prey needs to lose their nerve and attempt an escape, usually. More often than not, a servant standing their ground is all it takes for a pack to screech to a halt. Injuries on wolves have been reported many times that are almost certainly caused by moose. Now, a moose's headgear is often cited as a primary defense mechanism, but in actuality, it's their limbs. Moose are known for kicking with enough force to cave a wolf's skull in and send a bear retreating. Female moose don't possess antlers, and they even live more solitary lives than males, but the differential between mortality rates between the sexes is negligible. This doesn't mean that moose are invulnerable though. Predators are still a key component in population checks, and in fact, higher densities of predators generally correlate to lower moose densities. And that's basically the general point I want to convey at the very end of this. I don't want to give off the impression that I'm overcorrecting for the abuse Edmontosaurus has gone through over its history and say it would stomp a T-Rex in a fight, because the truth is, it wouldn't normally, simply because it wouldn't need to. The vast majority of the time, a Hadrosaur could just evade a Rex or get into thicker cover and there wouldn't be an issue. Defending itself like this would be most likely a last resort. This is why I don't really like who would win scenarios anymore, simply because there's very little nuance when discussing them. And really, the best way to look at these animals, in my humble opinion, is just that. Like animals. I just provided one method in which Edmontosaurus would win, simply because we almost never see it. Now, I'd like to hear your own opinions down in the comments below, and I would especially like to know if I missed anything major in my research, because I'm always paranoid of that. I hope this was worth the wait for you all, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.